Welcome back to Genetics in the Paddock. I'm your host, Emily Johnston, and I'll be taking you along on my journey to learn about all things genetics in extensive livestock. Livestock genetics has always been a topic that's interested me, and now working in the genetic space, it's fascinated me even more with just how powerful of a tool it can be. And I'm surrounded by so many knowledgeable people who are so willing to share their insight, so I thought, why not capture these conversations on a podcast that we can all learn from? In this episode, I spoke with Matt Wolcott, a research fellow from the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit in Armidale. He breaks down how we can utilise the genetic evaluation tools when looking to purchase a new sire, as well as a few other considerations. So you'll want to stick around for this one. And with that, let's get into it. And thanks so much, Matt, for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really excited to have a chat to you as your first appearance on the show.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So because it is your first appearance on our show, can you just give us a bit of an overview about you and the sort of work you do, and if there's any major projects you're working on, just all the little tidbits?
Yep. So I guess I started with AGBU almost 20 years ago now in the beef CRC years. I had done a master's in meat science with the meat science group in the beef CRC, mostly around ultrasound scanning, but then got interested in how those traits were being applied in industry. So I kind of followed those numbers up the hill and ended up at AGBU looking at the genetics of those traits, and eventually did a PhD that focused on the genetics of cow body composition and how those traits were relating to carcass performance at the genetic level. Since finishing my PhD, I've really maintained a focus on that cow side of things, how cows are able to maintain themselves in the paddock, particularly in Northern Australia where conditions are tougher, while we're still demanding performance from the carcass end from their steer half sibs. And that dichotomy is quite interesting genetically, how we need cows to be tough and survive and be reproductively successful while wanting steers to be fat and grow fast and have good eating quality. And I've always found that interesting.
That sounds like a lot of really interesting work, Matt, and it sounds like from your first exposure with AGBU and your PhD, it must have come a long way since then, and I can only imagine all the evolution that's come from the work that you've done as well. So today we're going to, I suppose, follow on from the earlier episodes that we've had in the podcast. So today with Matt, I really wanted to bring him in to kind of see how we mesh all of this together so we can move in the right direction as buyers or sellers, depending on which one you are, and sort of just understand how they all combine and how we can use these tools to our advantage. So I guess that leads me, Matt, to ask you, where do we start with all this and how do we get going with using these breeding values and indexes together to achieve the breeding objective that we've set early on?
Yep. I think it's the critical question in all of this. This is where the rubber meets the road. And the goal of the two key sectors of our industry in this area, which are bull breeders and bull buyers, stud breeders and commercial producers, should be very closely aligned. I'm sure you would have observed that those people breeding bulls and supplying them into the commercial market have to have objectives that align very closely with the buyers of those bulls who are selling commercial animals ultimately as carcasses. But I think the objective around applying genetic evaluation is a little bit different for those two aspects of the industry. For commercial breeders, the main question is, what bulls can I identify and bring into my herd that are going to move my breeding objective forward? And that breeding objective is based around productivity. So it's going to be, based on the information that you were able to gather in developing your objectives. It's things like, are my reproduction rates adequate? Are my heifers conceiving or capable of conceiving at that first mating? Are my first rebreed animals conceiving at rates that are acceptable, understanding that that's always the hardest group to get a calf out of?
So that sounds a lot like the benchmarking sort of stuff that we spoke about in a couple of episodes before. So is that kind of like what you're trying to encompass, the bigger picture, is understanding how your herd and flock are performing in these individual traits that you might want to be selecting for?
That's exactly right. So it's really understanding how the genetics you're bringing into your herd and that you're producing in the next generation are performing in your environment and for the markets you're supplying. And that's always going to be specific to environmental areas and to different markets. So understanding how genetics are expressing themselves in your environment is really critical for commercial producers. For example, a birth weight EBV of plus 3 or 4 or 5 kilos can express itself quite differently in different environments based on a number of factors, including how the cows are going nutritionally, and a number of other issues will affect how that plus 5 kilo birth weight is expressed in the progeny on the ground. And having that understanding really helps you drive your understanding of what sort of genetics you need to bring into your herd.
Okay, so when we've got all that good and we understand how our herd's performing and we kind of know what we want to be purchasing, so we're looking at selection indexes and breeding values. Should there be an emphasis on maybe looking at one over the other first, or is there a kind of order that you'd recommend? Should we be looking at individual EBVs? Should we be considering the index available that best suits our breeding objective, or where should we kind of start in that process once we've identified where we're currently sitting?
Yep. I think a well-constructed index is, the best basis for an effective breeding program. Combines all of the EBVs we have into one number that is essentially genetic profitability. And that will be very specific to your system and the markets you're targeting. So I think indexes are a good first pass. They're the gross level at which you identify which animals are candidates to come into your breeding program. And if you had a perfect index, the need to look at individual breeding values would be lower. We never quite do, and people can't resist. So there's inevitably some comparison of individual breeding values. And that's kind of a second pass. That's particularly so as the number of bulls you are buying gets lower. I think where you're buying 1 or 2 bulls, you'll need to kind of identify the perfect animals for your situation is greater than if you're buying decks and decks of bulls in Northern Australia, where basing that decision on index alone works better. You're working by averaging across what is actually driving profitability. And if that's coming from really good reproduction in some bulls, maybe really good growth in others, a handful that are really good for both, but accepting that there are animals that perform in better aspects of your breeding objective is fine. But when you're kind of trying to buy small numbers of bulls, the need to kind of get that perfect animal is a little bit greater, or perceived as being a bit greater.
So when you're looking to buy that perfect bull or ram or buck or that just sire for your program, when you're looking at those EBVs, should you also have in mind some maybe non-negotiables that you're not willing to compromise on, like some areas where when you've benchmarked your herd or your flock that you just don't want to compromise, either going up or down for whichever reason that might be? Should you kind of have that in mind as well when you're looking at the individual EBVs after you've gone through the index stage?
I think you should, but a good index should go a long way to identifying those animals. I've done so much work in the north, and reproduction is such a key driver of productivity and profitability in those environments that it's the obvious one to use as an example. And I think your indexes should absolutely prioritise reproduction in that situation, but having a cut-off above which for days to calving you won't go is a perfectly reasonable position.
And what about for traits that aren't typically included in indexes? So for example, like temperament or like coat colour for goats, or just things that typically aren't included in those indexes themselves?
Yep. So at any given time, there's always going to be traits that are under genetic control, but we don't have in the evaluation. And people can only do their best with that. I kind of see it as the last pass in identifying which animals you're going to bring into your herd. You've checked that they're meeting general profitability from the indexes. You've made sure that they're not bad for any specific EBVs that you're interested in, and now you're looking at, are these animals the complete package? Are they displaying all of the traits that I want them to display? And that becomes a matter of looking at them. And I think there's a lot of concern in elements of the industry that people can focus too much on figures. And certainly we as advisors to the industry in that direction never recommend that. EBVs and indexes are part of the information you have to make decisions about the genetics you're bringing into your herd. There's any number of other aspects that are important as well. And certainly those traits that we don't have EBVs for is one of them. I would say though that it's an area we're always working on. You mentioned temperament and structure. Angus, for example, have EBVs for both of those, and they would be available to other breeds if they wanted to bite the bullet and record the information at the seed stock level that was needed to generate those breeding values. Other things like cow body composition, cow condition, again, how those cows are maintaining themselves is something we're working on at the moment. And we've got a lot of information on traits like teat and udder scores or sheath scores in the north that are potential EBVs if the industry wanted to get behind them, start recording that information at the seed stock level and submit it to breed plan and have that turned into a breeding value that they can then use.
So it sounds like there's a lot of new traits in the works as well, which is really exciting to hear, because I constantly hear that, these traits are important to people and things that they like to consider when making a purchase. So do you see these traits as well possibly being worked into a maybe new index or forming an existing one and kind of having some sort of emphasis on the traits that are inside there as well? And I suppose the second part to that question is, if people are really interested in, developing these new traits, like where would you suggest that they, kind of start pushing along that interest and, I suppose getting their breed societies thinking about, hey, this might be something that people are interested in?
I think certainly talking to us is a good first step. We're happy to talk to people about the possibility of bringing new traits into their evaluation. As these are decisions that are made at the breed society sort of level, who are representing the stud breeders, I think it's really critical that these decisions be made in conjunction with the buyers of those bulls. So what are the commercial realities? What are guys who are actually breeding animals to sell ultimately for slaughter seeing as the real drivers of profitability in their situation? And that, I think, is the best source of information as to what is going to be at the top of the list for new traits coming into the evaluation.
So for example, if I've started to think, if I'm wanting these new traits, would it be helpful to start recording as much data as you can, even if it's just at your property level, to try and, feed some of that information up, or do a bit of a raw data measurement across your herd or your flock, just to kind of push that along or show some interest or get a starting point? Is that something that's useful?
I think one of the really important things we need in any, talking about any element of genetic evaluation, is we have to have a trait. And key to a successful analysis of a trait is that we've defined it in a way where it can be recorded en masse in the seed stock industry. So before people start measuring things, I think we need to sit down and have the conversation about, how do we measure it? In what units are we recording it? When do we record it? On what class of animals? And that may be self-evident for some traits, but I think defining that trait is critical, and then people can go crazy. They can go out and measure it as much as they want, get that information into breed plan, and we can start this kind of traditional process of estimating genetic parameters, understanding how much genetic control there is, and then turning it into a breeding value, understanding how that trait interacts with all of the other traits in our evaluation, and finally bringing it into an index, estimating an economic value for it. How much is this actually impacting profitability, and giving it an appropriate weighting in an index.
Sounds like there's a lot to it, especially from the end of you guys to make a product that's going to be useful to everyone else. But I imagine that piece of information is just really useful for those people who, might be looking at different traits outside of, what's available at the moment. And they do put a lot of emphasis on that when making their selection purchases, whether it's from a buyer or breeder perspective. I'm sure that's, quite useful information. So we spoke a bit about the commercial sector and how they might go about buying a bull, but is there any sort of advice or anything different that might be useful for a breeder?
So the process for breeders is a little bit different, and by breeders I mean those in the seed stock sector. Really developing a breeding objective is the first step towards generating that next generation, which with the objective of genetic gain. In the seed stock sector, it should be all about creating animals in the next generation who are superior to their parents. And that's achieved by not only making the right sire selections, but by mating them as effectively as possible to the right cows in your herd. And there is technology and a lot of information we can bring to bear to help people make that decision. The most obvious one is the mate cell package, which does a really good job of matching bulls with females in a way that maximises genetic progress while keeping an eye on, and if needed, controlling inbreeding, which is always a bit of a spectre that we have to keep an eye on.
That sounds like a really, really great program, especially like it takes the complexity out of it for, those people who are making those breeding decisions. They don't have to sit there and kind of go through it all themselves. As a whole suite of programs that sound like they do it for you, which it sounds fantastic.
It's a system that I think is really underutilised in our industry. There's an awful lot of clever science under the bonnet of it, and it works really efficiently now. We can take lists of candidate sires and match them with your females in a way that will generate the optimal genetic progress for your herd, while making sure you don't fall into those traps of mating too many animals that are too closely related to each other.
And with that, just can you kind of decide on the level of inbreeding that you're comfortable with? Can you adjust that yourself, or is it something that's pre-selected based on he's probably going to be the best outcome for your herd or flock?
We have general rules about what's an acceptable level and what's not. People certainly can choose to work around that figure a bit. Some breeds are different to others in the level of inbreeding that they find acceptable. And line breeding has been a philosophy that's been around for some time, and it is an effective way of concentrating desirable genetics. The only problem is it concentrates undesirable genetics as well. So really the objective is to achieve the gains while minimising the rates of inbreeding.
Yeah, right. That sounds really, really useful. I'm surprised that, as you said, it's quite underutilised. I feel like that's could be a really important tool for people to kind of bring into their program and use it to the best of their advantage. It sounds like it takes out a lot of that guesswork and trying to figure out exactly, what sire to put over what animals as well. So yeah, that's awesome. So to summarise basically what you've said, to, I suppose, use these tools in an order that might be most useful, you would kind of look at your selection index first and identify the sires from that based on the one that you've chosen from your breeding objective. And then you would look at individual breeding values to see if they align with any non-negotiables you might have or any areas that you might not want to change. And then it goes down to the structure and all those kind of things that aren't included in the index. So is that kind of like a reasonable process for people to go along, or is it kind of just dependent on, I suppose, what your goals are?
That's certainly the way that I've done it. We, in our research projects, have to do a lot of mating of animals, buying of bulls, deciding which bulls to put in which paddocks, and for herds that we're helping with their breeding programs, we play a role in making those decisions as well. And I've found that is the most intuitive and kind of effective way to step through that list of to identify which animals you really want to bring into the herd.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap it up, Matt. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure that's cleared up a lot of questions that people might have about, we've got two really great tools here and how do we put them together to get the best outcome. And it's been awesome hearing about the mate cell stuff too. I think we'll probably hear about that later on in the show. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been really insightful to have a chat with you and hear about some of your experience and your thoughts on how we can best put it all together to achieve a really great outcome.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily, a podcast produced by the extensive livestock genetics team within New South Wales DPI. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of genetics and its impact on livestock production. If you found this episode informative and engaging, please consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a review. Your feedback is essential in helping me to continue to bring you valuable content on livestock genetics. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics or guests, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on social media or through email. We love hearing from our listeners and are always eager to explore the subjects that matter most to you.